Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining me today. In a classic non-dual text, we find this verse. Discern your own self, consciousness only, and of extremely pure nature, from the other factors in your empirical personality, as you might distinguish a king from amidst his army. Then, ever stand firm in that self, realizing your identity with it, and dissolve the whole realm of objects. The non-dual path to enlightenment is not complicated. Our task is clear and straightforward. It is to learn how to discern our own self from the other aspects of our nature, and then to stand firm in that self, realizing our identity with it. To achieve this goal, help in the form of the teachings is available. But the last word is not dependent on outer aids and accessories. The instruments and raw materials we work with are the factors in our own personality. The path is a matter of discovering that in us which is essential, unchanging, and which transcends time. This means learning to withdraw our sense of identification from those aspects of life which apply for some of the time only. Much of the time, we are absorbed in our various roles in the world. Some of these roles are played for a long time, like a career or the responsibilities of a parent. In the end, they do pass. But until we begin to reflect more deeply, we naturally identify what we are with such roles, and our mode of life is shaped by this identification. The same sense of identity applies to the transient processes of our thoughts and feelings. Sometimes we are happy, sometimes we're sad. But we do not think, there is happiness or sadness in my mind right now. Instead, we feel, I am happy or I am sad. So our long-term roles and also our ephemeral mental states claim our identity feeling. And so, the way forward is simply to learn to discriminate between self and not self. How are we to do this? In some respects, this is clear, because as has been said, self and not self are distinct as light and darkness. The world of objects, the not self, is ever changing. Objects disappear from view in darkness or when our attention is elsewhere. All that lives must die. In complete contrast, self is that which does not change, which is self-luminous, and in which there is no limitation or suffering. The dialectics of non-duality lead to this conclusion, and direct experience reveals self as pure being, pure consciousness, and pure bliss. And yet, is the path to this realization entirely straightforward? In order for us to discern the self directly, it would have to be an object among objects. But self can never be an object. To look for self among the objects of experience is to emerge bemused and deluded. But how else can we search for the self? The answer to this question has a philosophical aspect and a practical one. Philosophically, it is true that self cannot be known as an object, and yet it is not unknown either. Self is not an object of knowledge, nor is it the process of knowing. It is that which is prior to all knowing and knowledge. Self is self-luminous, self-revealed, self-supporting. It is the light and the ground of all experience and manifestation. At first, the existence of the self appears to our understanding as an undeniable conclusion, or as that which cannot be negated. As such, this might be dismissed as just another thought. But self is not the conclusion that we are conscious of. Self is the consciousness of consciousness, the self-luminous light of lights. It is our being, and it is not different from the being of all. The sense of intellectual certainty about the self can prepare the way towards realization of our identity as the self. Thus, self is discerned through reflection, contemplation, and meditation, guided by the non-dual principles. The practical answer to the question of how to distinguish self from the other elements of our personality is that we do so by bringing our life into harmony with the universality of being. Self is one alone and is the unity underlying all experience. Then, to harmonize with this universal principle, our thoughts and feelings are to focus on what unites, not what divides. On the ethical plane, the spirit of acceptance, tolerance, and fellow feeling tends towards unity. Therefore, such virtues may be said to conform to the reality of self. In contrast, the tendency to view the world and its people in terms of likes and dislikes is not in harmony with the all-embracing nature of self, and can bring us no nearer to the liberating self-knowledge. Similarly, the self is free of all conflict, so our own watchword is to be goodwill, not confrontation, cooperation before competition. The wise do not afflict the world and are not afflicted by the world. In this way, the qualities and virtues extolled by all the great wisdom traditions are means to bring our life, inner and outer, into harmony with the nature of self. If we make these adjustments to our ways of thinking and doing, we will find that we will not need to distinguish the self from the rest. Rather, the self, so to say, will distinguish us through the working of a higher law of our being. That law is that the more we attune our life and thoughts to the nature of the deeper reality in our own being, the more that reality will reveal itself as our true self. It cannot be otherwise. This endeavor to bring ourselves into harmony with the ideal of non-duality will support our reflections and meditation. We will be increasingly attracted by writings and culture that express eternal values and promote their pursuit. We shall learn to enjoy the legitimate pleasures of the world, but not to seek lasting fulfillment and security in what passes. Self is inwards, and so we seek within. This doesn't mean being always psychologically introverted. It is to recognize the unchanging, self-luminous being within all phenomena. The self is that which apparently contains all seeming manifestation without itself becoming finite. Therefore, we practice stilling the mind so that it may be alert and receptive to all things, but not identified with anything. Our final and most far-reaching means of aligning our inner being with Atman, the Self, is to affirm our identity with it as an ever-accomplished fact. We are that even before we inquire into it. The mind may be convinced that the reality we have been reflecting on is somehow remote and can only be actualized by means of a long course involving various practices and forms of meditation. But friends, this is a conviction in the mind, not the ultimate reality. The great role of the affirmative meditations is that they wean us from this erroneous idea of remoteness and dissolve the apparent barriers to the realization of identity. Friends, this reality is not remote. It is our true self, ever present, self-evident, and subject to confirmation in our own direct experience. There is work to do. It is not for the mind itself to say that it is the one beyond all needs and striving. The mind is not the self. The mind and heart are to be absorbed in loving affirmation of that which transcends all separations and limitations. One such affirmation is this: my true self is not the body, not the mind. They are my apparent instruments. Self is eternal, self-luminous consciousness, and I am that.